Hello everyone, my name is Debbie Podrosky and I'm presenting to you today on behalf of my co-authors about scoping for risk, engaging stakeholders in integrated ecosystem assessment as part of the Mission Atlantic project. So the Mission Atlantic project is a Horizon 2020 funded international collaborative project which is looking to use integrated ecosystem assessment, or IEA, to establish the risks posed by pressures from human activities and climate change to inform sustainable use of the Atlantic ecosystem. We do this through a range of case studies, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the Celtic Sea case study. The IEA concept has been around for a while, but the easiest way to explain it is that it is a cycle that looks at where we are now, where are we going in the future, or where do we want to be, developing a plan for how we will get there, implementing the plan, and assessing if we made it and if not, why not. So it's iterative and reflective. The first stage of IEA is scoping and/or prioritization. You can carry out risk assessment in order to identify what are the highest risk interactions within your system, or you can work with stakeholders to identify what are the key things on the top of their agendas. We decided to do both, with our first stakeholder meeting hosted in June of last year. We had 28 attendees. Unfortunately, it had to be carried out exclusively online due to the COVID-19 pandemic. We asked our stakeholders for their first impressions by asking them what is their biggest concern in relation to the Celtic Sea. The responses were fairly consistent, with overexploitation, generally in relation to fishing, coming out on top, along with climate change. We then worked to ground truth some of the initial groundwork that we had done, which was identifying 17 sectors, 20 pressures and 26 ecological characteristics of relevance to the area. We worked with the stakeholders to identify any omissions, any issues that they saw with the categories we were using, and to answer their questions. We then presented them with the results of our risk assessment using an adapted ODEM approach, which is in line with the approach that has been used by the IC's IEA working groups. Our initial results identified 1,619 linkage chains. Each one of those was then scored for 3 attributes: the spatial overlap, the frequency and the degree of impact, to give us an impact risk score that could be used to carry out a prioritization exercise. This exercise gave us the table that you can see in front of you that identified the top 5 sectors and top 5 pressures that account for the majority of the risk in the system. And this allows us to know where to direct our efforts and what is relevant for taking forward in our IEA. We also asked the stakeholders directly what were the emerging issues that they were concerned with. Marine protected areas and offshore renewable energy, or wind farms, and their interactions with fisheries were the primary concerns. Of course, the context of climate change and the cumulative or interactive effects that may come from multiple sectors at sea were also on their agenda. We finished up by developing a future plan with action points and detailing our follow-up. My colleague Jed Kempf also carried out some integrated trend analysis and indicator analysis that he can describe much better than I can, so please do check out his talk in session A. But some of the relevant findings that were presented were that the environment was relatively stable throughout the study period, and that reducing fishing effort had effectively increased fish abundance, and so the primary identified driver within the region and the time period examined was due to fishing pressure rather than environmental drivers. Next, we focused our efforts on explaining the model that would be used to perform the scenarios that we were discussing. The Strath E2E, or end-to-end model, is a model that budgets for all of the energy via nitrogen in the system. It focuses on processes explained by equations, is highly accessible and can be run on an ordinary laptop, and there's even an app that can be used for the stakeholders to work directly with it. You can learn more by clicking on the link below, so please feel free to pause the video and have a look. This work has been carried out by our colleagues at the University of Strathclyde. Strath E2E, being an end-to-end model, has a lot of components. I don't have time to go through them all, but please feel free to press pause and have a look through the details yourself. For the second stakeholder workshop, we focused on scenario building. We had 19 participants, again unfortunately had to be online, and this was carried out last July. We updated them on the developments to date and went through the model in greater detail than I've been able to give you today, and then we gave them a demonstration of the website app and some time to play with it in order to help them come up with some scenarios. The scenario discussion remained relatively consistent with what had been previously identified. The potential ecosystem and fisheries impacts of offshore renewable energy were of primary interest still. They were also interested in looking at what displacement effects this may have on fishing, and the impacts of conservation measures such as MPAs, whether they are considered as complete exclusion zones or other effective conservation measures. And of course all of this needs to be taken account of in the context of climate change. The last thing that we did in this workshop was some conceptual modelling exercises. Conceptual modelling is very useful for a number of things, to build contour understanding and access knowledge that otherwise is quite difficult to get a handle on. If you want to learn more, please do check out my other talk in session or. For these purposes, participants were asked to consider what effects and interactions were expected from an increase in offshore renewable energy. And then we had a facilitated online co-creation exercise via open discussion that produced this conceptual model here. The model highlighted potential benefits, not just impacts, so things like employment and artificial reefs were discussed. Many interactions were identified, as you can see by all the lines connecting everything. Nuances and subpressures were also recognised, such as with noise, the operational noise versus the construction noise were differentiated, and it helps us to identify what priorities are there for further research, and also how to include socio-ecological interactions, so things like the cultural heritage and diversification of the fleet, along with the economics, were also discussed. Finally, we finished on our next steps, which are to continue to define and refine the scenarios, to implement identified scenarios in Strategy to E and report back to the stakeholders, engage more stakeholders from offshore renewable energy, identify case studies of co-location and successes, and investigate the possibility of using Bayesian belief networks to integrate our conceptual models and our process model outputs. So this will keep us busy for the next while, and hopefully you have found this interesting. If you have any further questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch. Thank you very much for your attention.